I'm going to start today, as I promised, with the feature that is supposed to get students to class on time, which is talking about today's news using the concepts of this class. And in particular, a lot has happened since last Wednesday. I don't know if you paid attention to this news, that Mario Draghi, the ECB met, and they made a very big announcement that they're really prepared to support the value of the short-term debt of the peripheral countries. And that's gotten some of the German central bankers pretty upset, and that's playing itself out. There's in today's FT, Financial Times, on page 2, there's also a sort of preview of George Soros. It's actually quite a provocative title here. It says, "Lead or Leave Currency Bloc," Soros tells Germany. But I'm not so much interested in the politics of this as the economics, because he has his own proposal for what he says the ECB is not doing enough and we need to do more, and he has his own proposal. So what I want to just compare here quickly, in last lecture, I talked about the difference between liquidity and solvency. Okay, and basically that's what this is all about. He's saying the ECB can deal with liquidity problems, but there are also solvency problems, and that also needs to be addressed. So this is just a way of consolidating the lesson from last time. Let me just show you what I'm talking about here. What Mario Draghi is doing is dealing with the position of bondholders who are holding short-term peripheral, meaning this isn't a negative term, meaning Spain, Italy, the countries that are in the periphery of Europe, the ones that are in trouble, short-term peripheral debt here. Okay, and or investors of any kind here. These could be banks as well. And I'm putting assets here on the left and liabilities on the right. I'm not showing you the whole balance sheet. The point is that these spreads, the interest rates that Spain and Italy are paying on their short-term debt are very much higher than the interest rates that Germany and France are paying on their short-term debt. And what the ECB has said is it's essentially going to cap those, not officially, it hasn't set an exact cap, but it's going to do this by basically buying this debt. It's going to enter the market as a buyer. What does that mean? That means the ECB is going to buy this short-term bills. Bills is the word we use for short-term debt often. Bonds usually means longer term. It's going to buy short-term bills, and it's going to do it, initially at least, by expanding its balance sheet, by creating more money. Okay, so this is when people say, "Oh, they're monetizing government debt." This is what they have in mind. This sort of balance sheet operation here, where you're expanding the balance sheet on both sides. This money is paid to these bondholders who sell that and acquire money instead. Okay, so this is the Draghi operation, and this is a liquidity operation in the sense that they're trying to support the value of these bills, drive down the interest rates that the peripheral countries are paying on their debt. Okay, we're going to pay a lot of attention to operations like this in this course, and there's a lot more sophistication there. So I'm just making it very simple at the moment. But I want to compare that to a solvency operation, which is what George Soros has in mind. And he is focusing on, he says, that's buying some time, but it's not dealing with the fundamental problem. Okay? And the fundamental problem is that some of these peripheral countries have way too much debt. Okay? It's not just that the prices are somehow misaligned, okay? But one of the reasons the prices are misaligned is because the debt to GDP ratio in these countries is just all out of whack. And so, and in particular, greater than 60%, debt to GDP greater than 60%. And so he proposes, and this is, other people propose things like this as well. I'm just taking it from this article here. He proposes, so the bondholders are holding, and this is long-term debt. So let's call this the excess bonds, peripheral bonds. So this is long-term debt of the periphery, okay? And he suggests that what we should have is an EFA, and what does that stand for? the European Fiscal Authority. European Fiscal Authority, which is essentially like the US Treasury. So it will be a fiscal unit of Europe as a whole. And he wants the EFA to buy these excess bonds. Okay, and to finance the purchase of these by issuing its own short-term debt, which are the liability of Europe as a whole. So that's why I call them Euro bills. Bills because they're short-term, Euro because it's the whole, it's all of Europe. It's not individual peripheral countries on this side. And so, and then he says, and we should have those Euro bills be the best collateral. The ECB should accept these as the best collateral in the world. So there's a monetary piece of that in part to help the operation get going, where the ECB maybe buys these Euro bills by expanding its balance sheet. Okay, and that money is what ultimately is paying for this. You see, you're going to get used to this pattern of thinking. We do this a lot in this class, where you say, you know, this and this are the same thing, this and this are the same thing, this minus and this plus are the same thing. There are two sides to these transactions, and we're booking both of them. Okay. Now, the whole point of this operation, he says, is that once we have bought these excess bonds, maybe we can forgive them and therefore take away the excess burden on the peripheral countries. We've basically moved them up to Europe as a whole. Instead of being the debt of Spain or the debt of Portugal, they're the debt of Europe. And if we forgive them, obviously the net worth, okay, if we forgive these excess bonds, the net worth over here, which is a balancing item, is going to take a hit. That's a solvency issue. Okay, but the point is that Europe is solvent, okay, and Portugal is not, or not as solvent. So that's the idea, is to move this debt to the larger entity, which is solvent, and therefore take away the fundamental problem underneath that. Now, there's a lot of politics about this. Why should we write off that debt? You know, these are a bunch of profligate people, and we need to impose austerity on them. There's a lot of talk about that. I'm just talking about the mechanics to understand what they have in mind. You see here there's an expansion of the money supply as well, but what George Soros says, and it's mentioned in this article, is that this might not be the end of the story here, because at the moment, banks all over Europe, okay, don't trust each other, and so they are holding enormous quantities of reserves, okay, at the ECB. Remember how last time I showed you how the Fed had like $1.5 trillion worth of excess reserves? There's something like this happening at the ECB too. And what he suggests, and of course they're getting no interest at all on those reserves that they're holding at the ECB. So he thinks that what could happen is that these banks will trade this money for these Euro bills. And in doing so, shrink back the balance sheet of the central bank. Okay? So the point is that by dealing with the solvency problem, you're using the balance sheet of the ECB only temporarily to help distribute these bills, and then they wind up over here and the money disappears. So you haven't monetized any debt, ultimately, at the end of the story. See that? You haven't monetized any debt. In fact, what you've done is to take a lot of excess reserves out of the system and substitute these Euro bills for them. This is the idea, by focusing on the solvency issue. But we're not there yet, because there's a lot of politics there, okay? So we're doing this instead, okay? It's left to the ECB, basically because there is no European financial authority. There is no Europe-wide treasury. There is no Europe-wide fiscal authority. And this is what always happens. When central banks do very bold things, it's because somebody else isn't doing their job, okay? And so that's what Draghi is doing. That's what Draghi is doing. He's holding the system together, and you can criticize him as much as you want, okay? But he is acting as a central banker, and understanding the mechanics, what in fact these are about. I think could help a lot with having a more sane political discussion about what is at stake here, instead of throwing around words like hyperinflation and so forth, thinking about what are the alternatives.